This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Pulitzer Prize-winning military historian David Kennedy talks about the politics of war and relations between the military and their civilian bosses. Bernie Sanders may be attracting a lot of young people, but government professor Jennifer Lawless says they generally show no interest in running for office themselves, ever. And Bill Press talks with Keith Mestrich, a progressive, that's right, a progressive banker. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Military historian David Kennedy says the military-industrial complex isn't what it used to be, and he advocates attaching a specific appropriation to any congressional authorization for the use of force. And we say hello to Stanford professor David Kennedy, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford. He is editor of a collection of essays, among the many publications he's been a part of, The Modern American Military, with contributions by leading thinkers in the field. David Kennedy, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you, Jim. Happy to be with you.
And it's nice to have you with us as well. Why do you think all our wars since Korea have been so politicized and polarizing?
Well, I'm not sure I'd agree with the premise that all of our wars since Korea have been politicized and polarizing. Some of our, maybe not strictly speaking wars, but certainly military interventions have been quite popular, not least of all because they've been brief and successful. So think of things like Panama and Grenada, for example. But those particular actions have properties that are worth thinking about, and not least of all that they were quite brief in time and that they accomplished their objectives. So longer wars, I think, are always politicizing and polarizing, and it's part of the task of leadership in longer wars. It has been historically, not only in this society but everywhere, to sustain support for the action when it becomes more difficult and protracted and so on. Every major combatant in World War II worried about that, including the United States. There were significant worries that the American people might lose their taste for the conflict when it became clear that it was going to go on for years, not just months. Civil War, the same proposition. So the fact is that the thing that has driven, or the factor that has driven some of our recent wars to be so politicized and polarizing, as you say, is that they've been protracted and that the nature of victory has been very difficult to define. So think Korea, think Vietnam, think Iraq, think Afghanistan. All of them dragged on much longer than originally anticipated, and it wasn't at all clear there was no consensus about what victory might mean. And that's a formula for incubating all kinds of popular discontent with the action. I mean, the most famous episode of popular disenchantment with military action or war, of course, in recent times is Vietnam, where by the late 1960s, that war had lost majorities of support in the country, and that's among the things that brought it to the messy, inconclusive end that it came to. Mm-hmm. No way you can call that one a victory for the United States. So there's an older thought about this, that so-called limited wars are also very difficult to sustain in a polity like ours because they demand sacrifice and commitment of human and material resources, but for objectives that the public in general has a very difficult time understanding. So restoring the 38th parallel in Korea as a war aim in the Korean War, for example, didn't seem like the kind of objective that really warranted all that sacrifice and death and destruction and privation and so on and so forth. And again, I defy anybody to say with clarity, in a way that compels mass agreement, what exactly was the objective in Iraq or Afghanistan. And so the public has difficulty understanding the purpose of these actions, and I dare say the political leadership there's considerable confusion even at that level as to what the objective is.
You know, you talk of a cultural divide between those who serve in the military and their families and those who don't. Does that division lead to the military becoming more politically conservative and thus more likely to favor aggressive foreign policy?
Well, let me take apart that question a little bit.
Sure.
As a matter of fact, I think the military, especially the senior military leadership, in the whole spectrum of our decision-making structure about when and how to use force as an instrument of policy, by and large, the military are the most conservative and prudent and restrained because they have a better, more focused idea than a lot of other people in the decision-making process about exactly what is the nature of military force and what it can accomplish. So you'll often find people like, for example, Colin Powell in the first Iraq War in 1991, sounding a note of caution about exactly what can be accomplished through the use of military force. So I don't quite agree with the premise that the military is that they're all warmongers just because they're wearing uniforms and war is their business. In my experience, and I think also just in the historical record, professional warriors are amongst the most cautious and prudent and restrained advocates of military force. And that's enshrined in certain doctrines at the Pentagon, the most famous one, I suppose, being the Weinberger Doctrine, articulated in the late 1980s and updated with the so-called Powell Doctrine in the 1990s. And all that doctrine, its central point is that the use of military force must be a last resort, only after all other options have been exhausted. Those are doctrines developed at the Pentagon by military people. So I think the idea that the military is an advocate in general for the use of force is greatly exaggerated. Now, all that said, there's polling data that suggests very, very strongly that the members of the military are, by and large, more conservative in their political views than the public in general. The Military Times, which is a military publication for military people here 2 or 3 years ago, did a poll in which it turned out that the rate of registration as Republicans in the officer corps of the United States military was more than double what it is in the society at large or in civil society. So, yes, that's just a demonstrated or acknowledged fact that people in the military, especially long-term lifers, officer corps, tend to be, in general, in their political views, more conservative than the average citizen out there in civil society.
But doesn't necessarily point to more aggressive military-style behavior. It just happens to be that way.
That's right. And again, I think it's a really a category error to say that the military, by their very nature of warfare as their business and so on, are therefore always consistently the most aggressive advocates of the use of force to pursue policy ends. I think that's just not true.
Mm-hmm. Now, not that anyone is in favor of war, but would it be better for the nation's unity if the draft were reinstated so that in another war there are more troops and from a more diverse political background?
Well, my general position on that question is that if you want to pursue this, you have to will not only the ends, but also the means. So the end of more national unity and cohesion because of shared experience, shared sacrifice. I mean, who could not get on board with that? That's a praiseworthy end. The idea that a draft force or a conscript force would, by its very nature, introduce elements of prudence into the decision to use force, that also, I think, is quite demonstrable. And also, who can disagree with that? But if you want to achieve those ends, all right, then you have to also will the means to get there. And my own personal view this is not a deep scholarly view, but my personal view is that the state does not have or should not have the right to command a year or two or whatever of any citizen's life, and unless there is an existential threat, clear and present danger, and existential sort to the integrity of the republic itself, such as we saw in World War II, arguably in the Civil War as well. So I'm just not in favor of conscription absent that kind of clear and present existential threat. Now, again, that said, there are other, if the problem we're trying to solve for here is more citizen engagement, with the military and with this all-important decision to use coercive military force as an instrument of policy. If that's our objective, there are ways to go toward that objective, maybe not reach it completely, but go toward it well short of conscription. For example, quite a practical matter that I think could be accomplished, like this is not a utopian idea at all, would be some kind of a congressional statute that would say that if there's ever an authorization for the use of military force, of the sort there was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the Iraq War resolution, and so on, any such legislation that authorizes the use of military force must, as a matter of absolute requirement, include within it a fiscal appropriation scaled to the anticipated size of the deployment and duration of the deployment. In other words, a surtax of some kind that would be immediately felt by citizens at large. They see it in their tax bill, and they would feel the fiscal effects, at least, of these kinds of actions quite immediately in their pocketbook. So I think that would be one way to compel a greater degree of citizen focus on military decisions and the decision to resort to military force at all than we have now. In the recent Iraq War back in the early 2000s, the Bush administration, not only did we not impose a surtax as we undertook that action, but we actually cut taxes on our way into that war, which is virtually unprecedented in the history of warfare, that you can ask a people to pay less in their tax bill even as the society is undertaking a major military action. So that's one, I think, small but practical step that could be taken in the direction of more citizen engagement with the whole military apparatus.
We're speaking with Stanford professor David Kennedy, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford, also the editor of a collection of essays, The Modern American Military. Do you think the addition of gay and transgendered people to the military will have any effect on readiness one way or another? And is there an overall decline in the quality of recruits?
Well, again, I think those are two distinct questions.
Absolutely.
As a matter of social equity and fairness and living up to our ideals of being a comprehensive and inclusive society, I think it's absolutely necessary that we allow gay and transgendered people to be eligible for military service along with any other citizen. So I think that in my mind, that was a slam dunk, and it's justifiable and indeed even necessary on grounds of social equity and fairness and putting our money where our mouth is with respect to our own principles. So that's an easy one, I think. But there's a big, broader question that has little or nothing to do with gay or transgendered people about the quality of recruits that are coming forward in the all-volunteer force. And the services themselves are quite worried about their ability to recruit a sufficient quantity of people with sufficient skill sets to really operate the modern military machine the way it's constructed to be operated. A lot of weapon systems are very high-tech. They can't be run by just any Joe Schmo. They've got to have skilled people, well-trained people with the skills to operate those systems. And all the services, particularly the Navy and the Air Force, which are even more technologically reliant than the Army as a rule, are quite worried that they're not able to attract a sufficient number of recruits with those kinds of skills, or who can be trained to acquire those skills. So I think that's another issue that plagues or infests the whole concept of the all-volunteer force, and it's one for which we don't, as of right now, have a very good solution.
You know, it's been over half a century since President Eisenhower, arguably the greatest military leader of all, warned against the power of the military-industrial complex. It hasn't gone away, has it?
Well, it doesn't look the way it did in Eisenhower's time. Again, the Pentagon budget is a much smaller fraction of GDP than it was then. When he made that famous speech, the Pentagon budget was the biggest single item in the federal budget, and it was commanding about 10% of all the society's resources, or of GDP, gross domestic product. Today, the military is no longer the biggest part of the federal budget. That's Social Security and Medicare. And as a percentage of GDP, it's down in the 3%, 2.5%, 3% range. So that it's in terms of scale, that problem, the military, the power of the military-industrial complex is not what it used to be. However, as we all know from just reading the daily papers, there are these quite specific localities in various congressional districts and states where employment is heavily dependent on defense contractors of one kind or another, and they have their voice in Washington, D.C., and they are a continued pressure, you might say, to maintain certain levels of spending on certain weapons systems and certain items and certain bases that may or may not be truly necessary. In fact, it's not uncommon these days for the Pentagon to say, we don't need this weapon system or we don't need these bases any longer, but the political class defends the existence of these things in their home districts, and that's a big inertial drag on the efficiency of the economy and the military itself.
Absolutely. Now, before we let you go, do you see a danger that contractors who are now fighting our wars, or certainly parts of it, do they have a self-interest in promoting war?
Well, it's hard to believe otherwise, isn't it? I mean, that is their business, and they have no other business that one can see. And I think the whole picture that emerged out of the Iraq and Afghan wars, where at certain times at the height of those engagements, there were more contractors in those countries than there were uniformed U.S. military personnel, which means we outsourced a large part of those efforts to people who were not in the regular chain of command, subject to the usual command and control procedures, ethics, tactics of warfare, and so on. And we know there were some extremely ugly episodes where armed contractors went off the reservation and did things that gave this country a great big black eye in the eyes of the world. So I think the whole business of contractors needs to be deeply rethought. That kind of outsourcing, I think, it so deeply contradicts the basic notion of what it means to owe the duty of service to your country, that we shouldn't just hire mercenaries to do that kind of thing. That should be a citizen obligation. It probably means we need to upsize the armed forces a bit as we downsize, I would say, virtually to the 0 point, those kinds of contractors.
Okay. Stanford Professor David Kennedy joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford, and editor of a collection of essays, The Modern American Military. Professor David Kennedy, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks, Jim. I enjoyed talking with you.
As we enjoyed it as well. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. Government professor Jennifer Lawless has studied the attitudes of high school and college students and finds they are so turned off by politics almost none of them foresee ever running for office. We'll talk to her more about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Gosh, Americans don't need enemies like China when we've got protectors like Obama. In his pitch to get us to swallow that glob of global corporate greed known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, President Obama has resorted to a tacky bit of China bashing. He recently crowed that, quote, under this agreement, we, rather than countries like China, are writing the rules for the global economy. This backhanded slap at a major trading partner is meant to tell us that big bad China would have written global trade rules to hurt the American people. Aside from the fact that we and our allies would never agree to such biased rules, even if the Chinese were stupid enough to propose them, Obama's assertion contains two self-destructive bombshells, both tucked inside the word we. First, if okayed by Congress, this TPP scam would offshore a whole new round of America's middle-class jobs, hold down or even lower U.S. wages, flood our market with unsafe imported food, free Wall Street banksters from oversight, and empower global corporations to use private trade tribunals of corporate lawyers to usurp our people's sovereignty. How embarrassing that our own president would claim credit for doing such explosive damage to the American people. I'm guessing that even China would not have done worse. Second, Obama's entire TPP charade is blown to bits by his assertion that we are writing the rules. Who's we? Were you consulted? Did you even know that a tiny group of unelected people have been meeting in secret for 7 years to write rules for us? In fact, only about 600 corporate executives and lobbyists were allowed to be at the table, writing rules to benefit themselves at our expense. This is Jim Hightower saying it's a disgrace that Obama is fronting and even lying for these self-serving, kleptocratic corporate powers.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. How do we get high school and college students to harness their do-gooder spirit into elective politics? Professor Jennifer Lawless suggests video games. And we say hello to Jennifer Lawless, who's a government professor at American University in Washington. She is the author, along with Richard L. Fox, of a new book called Running from Office, Why Young Americans Are Turned Off to Politics. Jennifer Lawless, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we appreciate your time. You and your co-author have identified a pretty serious problem. Young people don't give a darn about politics. How bad is the situation?
Well, we'd argue that it's quite bad, but it's not just that they don't care a lot about politics. We actually find that, yes, they're not particularly politically interested, but they've actually written off the idea of running for office in the future. So up until now, we've known that young people tend to be a little bit obsessed with what's going on in their own lives. They tend to be wedded to their digital devices. We know that they watch less news than older generations, but we haven't really linked that to what that means for their likelihood of throwing theirselves into the ring when they're older. And we found that 9 out of 10 high school and college students have already decided that that is something they will never do.
Wow, that's startling to me that it would be that high. So if they don't want to run for office or work in campaigns, do they even care about voting?
Voting is the one area where they at least know that the socially desirable response is that they're supposed to care. And so that suggests that civics education and programs across the country that have tried to impress upon young people the power of their vote have worked. The problem is that those programs tend to stop at voting. And we know that the kinds of professions, the kinds of careers, the kinds of interests and hobbies that adolescents and young adults have map pretty well onto what they do later in life. So if young people look around at the current political environment and they find it hyper-partisan, polarized, mired in gridlock, they see scandal upon scandal, and that leads them to turn away from a political career now, there's nothing to suggest that their minds will change later.
You know, and it makes me think of when we talk about the midterm elections, which always have fewer people coming to the polls. You know, for young folks, if they're this disinterested in politics, I mean, that probably has that effect on those midterms? Why, if it's not, you know, it's not on their iPhone as they're walking down the street, there's no news about it, so why bother and why even think about it? They probably don't even know some of these elections are going on.
That's true, and we do have actually 500,000 elective offices in this country. So even beyond federal midterm elections, think about the low levels of interest and engagement at the state or even the local level. But there is one important distinction to make. It's not just that young people are tuned out, it's that they're turned off. And that distinction is important because when they do have some degree of exposure to politics, what they see suggests to them that they should seek out no more exposure to politics. So it's not that they're making this conscious effort to say, you know what, I don't care about what's going on in the world. I don't care about the news. I don't care about saving society or improving my community. It's that whatever they see tends to be painted in such a light that they don't think that running for office would be a way to solve problems. They don't think that serving as an elected official in any capacity is a noble profession. And ironically, it's because of the people they've seen in office and the news to which they have been exposed. So when they are tuned in, that's what turns them off.
I don't want to be like that person, or I don't want to do what that person's doing. Is there a gender gap among the disaffected?
There is. Richard and I have conducted surveys over the course of the last 15 years that have established that there's a pretty substantial gender gap among adults who are well situated to run for office, with women being about 16 percentage points less likely than men to be interested in running. We found among our college students, so 18 to 25-year-olds, a 20 percentage point gender gap. So that suggests that things are certainly not getting better over time, or that this gender gap will close in the next generation. The interesting thing we found was that among high school students, there was almost no gap. That gap opens up the minute you step foot on a college campus, and we think it has to do with the fact that once you have some choice over the kinds of extracurricular activities you pursue, over the kinds of classes that you take, interests begin to diverge. Whereas in high school, the boys and girls are competing against each other to get into the best colleges. They want to all be Renaissance people.
We're speaking with Jennifer Lawless, government professor at American University and co-author with Richard Fox of a new book called Running from Office, Why Young Americans Are Turned Off to Politics. Are these young voters aware that if they don't participate, somebody else will, and they may not like that?
I don't know if they're aware of it in those terms, but what we got the sense of, and this was from 4,000 national surveys that we conducted, as well as more than 100 hour-long phone interviews with some of the respondents, was that they think politics is not a place to get things done. They think it's full of confrontation and gridlock. They think it's a place where people have the goals of being obstructionists. And so they hold politics right now in such low regard that even if they think they won't run and other people will, it can't possibly be any worse than it already is. And so what we really need to do is impress upon them the fact that this federal lens through which they tend to assess the political sphere more generally is actually not representative of what happens in most communities, in most states, and even at the federal level, there are a lot of successes that just don't get much publicity.
Well, you know, it's interesting, and as I alluded to earlier, talking about the midterm elections and the turnout and that kind of thing, and I had a midterm or just a county election locally to me not too long ago. I was the 7th person that came in to vote. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. Poll had been open since 6. That's pretty depressing. And yet that's where everything happens in a community. It's at that level where you can really make a difference. How do you impart that on these young folks, that's actually their chance to make a difference in the political world?
Well, we end the book with a chapter that highlights some suggestions for the future and how we can chart a new course. And one of them has to do with this very point, which is generating some sort of national public service campaign that lets young people know what politicians do and the kinds of issues that they address and the way that they can get things done. Most of the people that we spoke to think about the political system and the government shutdown from 2013 or the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. Their first political memories are either Bill Clinton lying about Monica Lewinsky or George Bush lying about weapons of mass destruction. They don't think about anything beyond the federal level. And so if we could launch some kind of national public service campaign with really good, honest, earnest elected officials that hold a broad array of positions who are bringing about fundamental change in their communities, whether it's through policies dealing with the environment or education or roads or pollution, whatever. That would go a long way. I think back to my own childhood where, in 3 minutes I learned how a bill became a law with Schoolhouse Rock. We don't have that kind of sense anymore of imparting to young people information about the way the process actually works.
Do you think that abandoning politics mean that most young people don't want to be leaders? Or, and if not, how are they going to affect policy, if at all?
No, and that's the good news. We actually found in our survey, when we asked people about their goals for the future, that making the world a better place and improving their communities was very close to the top of the list. It was up there with getting married and having children and having a good job. So they do have a sense of civic responsibility. What we need to do is communicate to them that they can fulfill that sense of civic responsibility through electoral means. They don't only have to work for a nonprofit or stage an economic boycott or run an NGO. Those are all completely plausible options. But some of the best decisions get made and some of the best policies are actually written and implemented through politics and through electoral means. And so communicating that, I think, is the key. The ingredients are there. They want to make the world a better place. Now they just need to believe that running for office and serving as an elected official is a way to allow them to do so.
I find this interesting. You offer some proposals, and a couple of them involve video games and apps. Has it really come to that? Is that sort of, I guess you got to jump in and go after them the way they understand?
Yeah, you got to meet them where they are, right?
Yeah.
Well, a couple of things. As far as the video games are concerned, we were stunned, but the average high school student plays 14 hours of video games a week. And that's not going to change. The average college student, it's about 12 hours of games a week. So if they're playing these games anyway, then why not generate games that would allow them to actually solve political problems or be challenged in a way that could potentially spark their political interest? As far as the app is concerned, we recommend that we develop an app that actually lets people type in their address, or it would know where you are, and it would tell you all of the elected offices that are available to you at that address, from dog catcher all the way up to President of the United States. Because even though we have 500,000 offices in this country, there is no clearinghouse to provide information for how to get on the ballot, what their responsibilities are, who currently occupies them. And so it's difficult to figure out how to generate interest if it's not even something a young person can find with the tap of their finger, which is how they're accustomed to accessing information.
You mentioned Schoolhouse Rock, and, I too grew up with that. So this is, in a sense, I guess, bringing Schoolhouse Rock to video games and apps that are more in line with the way these guys are thinking.
I think so. And by doing it that way, I think it also communicates to them that we're not asking them to change who they are. We're not asking them to change what's important to them. We're just asking them to integrate electoral politics into the way they go about their day-to-day lives.
Interesting stuff. Jennifer Lawless, government professor at American University here in Washington, D.C. She is the author, along with Richard Fox, of a new book called Running from Office: Why Young Americans Are Turned Off to Politics. Professor Jennifer Lawless, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Thank you for having me.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, progressive banker Keith Mestrich.
Yes, there may be no industry or no profession more maligned these days than bankers. So we've been on the search for a progressive banker. You don't think it's possible to find. We found one. Keith Mestrich is president and CEO of Amalgamated Bank and joins us in studio this morning. Hey, Keith, it's good to see you.
Good to see you, Bill.
What makes it? What's the different? Why is Amalgamated Bank different? First of all, you got a lot of support from labor unions, right?
We do, absolutely. We were founded in 1923 by a union.
Whoa, that far back.
That's 92 years, and we were founded by the Amalgamated Clothing Workers at a time that when there was no formal labor unions in this country. If you think about it, the National Labor Relations Act was not passed until 1935. And in 1923, workers didn't have an election system to be able to get representation in the workplace, so they had to do social unionism kind of things to build their membership. And the Amalgamated did great things. They built a ton of affordable housing in New York City. They founded a bank, an insurance company, a whole system of health clinics, and they really created a community amongst the million garment workers that were in the city at that time.
So what can you do differently then? Unlike most banks where just all the profit goes to, the shareholders or the executives, right? You try to pour back into the community? Is that...
Absolutely. Let me give you one example. Right? Yeah. The banking industry is the wealthiest industry in the entire country. Most successful industry, tons of people who are just doing very well at the top in that industry. But there's a dirty little secret in the banking industry, and that's that the biggest occupation in the banking industry is a teller, and the average wage for tellers in this country is $12 an hour.
And the average wage of your bank executive
is $12 million or something like that. At $12 an hour, and so we decided that we would take a stand and that we would take a portion of our profits and made sure that we shared it with our employees. And we were the first bank in the country to say that we were going to sign on to this campaign for a $15 an hour minimum wage, and we raised the minimum wage for everybody at our bank to $15 an hour and called on the rest of the industry to do the same. If there's any industry in this country that can afford to pay their workers $15 an hour, it's the banking industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, bravo. And what kind of response have you gotten from other banks?
Well, first of
they're
all,
rushing to get on board, right?
First of all, our employees who were making less than $15 an hour loved it. But there has not been a rush to sign on to it, as you might believe. The banking industry has been completely reluctant to even want to talk about it. They don't want people to think about the fact that they pay their tellers and security guards and janitors and food service workers something less than
a minimum wage, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you would and you would think again and it seems to be a powerful message here that if the wealthiest industry in the country is not doing it, I mean,
how can anybody else, right?
And they should be setting the example.
Right. And everybody thinks about, exactly as you said, Bill, everybody thinks about the people at the top making gobs and gobs of money. They forget that the industry is filled with low-wage workers, and we need to take a stand and make sure that we can be leaders on this issue and hopefully watch the rest of the industry follow.
I have done several programs with the American Bankers Association. And some of my liberal friends always say, well, what are you doing hanging out with those guys? But what I found is with that group, a lot of them resent what's happening on Wall Street and with the big banks, and they think the big banks have really given the little banks a bad name. Is that true?
I think that's right. There are many. I know now a lot of community bankers who really want to just do the right thing. They want to be leaders in their community. They want to help small businesses grow. They want to help people buy their first home. They want to do the right things. And they're not like the big investment banks that have done the things that people associate the banks with now. There's a lot of good people in the banking industry. We need to recognize that and be able to support them.
Yeah, you mentioned the community banks. So they're the people that really almost, in a community like that, they know you, you know them, right? Do you trust them and depend on them?
Absolutely. One of the real tragedies in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, quite rightly, the federal regulators have tightened up on the standards, making sure that banks do good loans, good quality loans. I support that 100%. People should do that. But one of the bad things that has happened is that it has made it hard for small banks to support small businesses and provide a lot of access to credit in that area. That's a problem that we have to take care of, and that's a problem that the banking industry cannot solve without the government coming in to actually help.
Now, I'm sure you've looked at this when somebody's looking around to choose a bank, right? And there are a lot of choices. Let's face it. What are they looking for? What do consumers want out of a bank?
Well, I think they want a decent interest rate, which has been hard to pay since 2008.
Yeah,
I think they want good services. Increasingly, they want good online services. They want to have, like we want in everything in our life now, you want to be able to go on your smartphone or your computer to be able to do it. We need to offer all those services. But we also think that what people want a little bit, or at least what progressives want, is a bank with a conscience and a bank that has a purpose in life, and is not going to contribute to the kinds of things that led to the downfall in 2008. But they want to have a bank that stands up against income inequality, a bank that stands up for diversity in the workplace, a bank that stands up for all the kinds of progressive principles that we believe in. But they want all those other things as well, so you have to offer both.
But there's a phrase, a bank with a conscience, right? Yeah. No, I mean, it's like a banker with a heart. Yeah, we used to always, in San Francisco, always laugh at, the Bank of America building in San Francisco, and there's that great big black rock on the plaza. It's a sculpture.
Yep.
In San Francisco, it's called that was a banker's heart. That big blank that black rock there. But you mentioned online. I wanted to ask you about that. How many people today actually walk into a bank and talk to a teller?
Well, I don't know that number, but
right. Well,
but we see the number
percentage-wise.
We see the number of transactions that actually happen on site in our banks declining rapidly. People just don't need to come into the traditional bricks and mortar kind of facility anymore. Businesses that do that or organizations that bank with us almost never come to the bank at all, and individuals increasingly less so. You can take a picture of a check and deposit it with your phone. We're less and less and less in a cash economy all the time. My kids never carry cash. They just make every transaction with their debit card. And they do that. So it is declining rapidly, and it means the banking industry has to respond to come up with the products and tools that really allow people to lead the kind of lives that they want to lead.
It used to be that you could only use your credit card, had to be $10 or whatever. But now you can.
Now you buy your Starbucks coffee in the morning and do a quick swipe. Do that. You ever talk to a taxi driver anymore about how many transactions are done with cash? Only like 10% of the transactions are done by cash in a taxi cab anymore.
Which always worries me because I'm not sure they get their tips.
I'm not sure they do either. Although I have noticed that the default tip now is 20% in the cab. So, maybe they're getting a little bit more.
They're adjusting.
Actually,
and they allow you as much as 25%. And I always look at that and that's pretty generous. But I usually do it anyhow. Peter, how often do you go to a bank?
I go to the bank I go a couple times a week.
No,
I go
like
twice a week. Actually, I'll tell you. One of the reasons I do is because
that's really.
I'm the exception, but I go mostly because we have the nanny and we pay cash and things like that. So that's why I go to the bank.
That's the real need. If you have cash needs, you have to go. To the
that's
bank
it. That's it. If I need to get cash, that's why I go to the bank.
The underground economy. But,
right.
But you're talking about an ATM.
Yes.
No. Right?
Yeah.
When you say go to the bank.
I don't go inside. I haven't stepped foot inside my bank.
That's really what I'm talking about. Inside the bank to have an exchange or an operation.
Did you see this this piece in the Wall Street Journal earlier this week about how much, though, the fees that many banks are charging for ATMs has gone up? So the average fee is now $4.50 to get money out of the bank. That's
and
crazy.
By the way, that's on both sides, right? Like if you're using an ATM that's not out of yours, you'll have to pay the $4.50, $5 to use that, but then your bank on the back end will also charge another $4, $5. So in the end, you might be paying $10 just for the privilege of using that ATM.
They don't have to. We have a whole network of 50,000 ATMs around the country. Us and other community banks, by the way. It's not just us. Figure out a way to actually have a network where people don't have to pay anything to get their money out of a bank. It's just another way,
that's huge,
right? That a lot of the banks have found ways to rip off the consumer when they can't get a lot of interest on their loans. They're finding other ways to make money, and it's just not fair.
No, I'm so glad you went there because that's where I was heading to. Because I remember when the credit cards first kind of started out there, it was these are free, right? Won't cost you a dime, and then it was $1. If you were not at your own bank, right? And now it's what? What's the average?
That average is now $4.50.
What a ripoff!
It's crazy. The average deduction that comes out of or withdrawal from an ATM machine is $60. So if you're paying $4.50 to get $60 out of the bank, that's a pretty usurious rate, really.
Yeah, no, it really is. You've been around since 1923. Where can people find a branch of the Amalgamated Bank?
So we have 14 branches in the New York City metropolitan area.
Whoa.
Many in Manhattan, but in the outer boroughs as well. We have one here in Washington, D.C., and we have one in Los Angeles.
And is there again, it's amalgamatedbank.org.
.com.
I'm sorry, .com. Thank you. Is there a network of banks, other progressive banks that have formed a network like you? That
There are a few banks in this country and around the world who try and take on a mission-based objective like we do. There's a bank in California that really focuses on the environmental community. And there is a new resource bank out in California that tries and do some things. But we are by far and away the largest mission-based banking institution in this country or really in the world.
Yeah, check it out at amalgamatedbank.com again.
And people don't need to go to our branch, Bill. They can go online and they can open an account and they can do whatever they want online.
That's the point. No, they can do that.
Man.
If you're a progressive and you live in Wyoming, the few progressives that live in Wyoming, you can open a bank account and bank with us as well.
Just don't tell Dick Cheney. Right. No, but that's true. I mean, you don't have to think about one you can walk to anymore.
No,
right?
that's absolutely not.
Right. So nationwide, wherever you are, amalgamatedbank.com. In general, in your role as president of a bank, you look at the American economy. How are we doing today?
Well, Bill, I'll tell you what, I'm a little worried. I mean, you watch what's happening around the world, and it is not a rosy picture. And we are starting to see that in sort of the trade deficit figures and some other things now, that the perils economically around the world are starting to seep into the American economy. And what I'm worried about is after this long period of sustained no interest rates, there are no monetary tools left for the Fed to really do to act if the economy goes south. And unfortunately, our Congress is completely unwilling to use the traditional fiscal tools of taxation and spending policy to try and resolve our problems. So I think there's reason to be concerned.
Are you do you, in terms of Dodd-Frank or the Wall Street, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, of course, I think Dodd-Frank's a joke. Has Dodd-Frank made any difference, or do we need more tougher regulations on Wall Street?
Dodd-Frank was a brilliant piece of legislation. It is difficult to be a bank executive and say that. It is not a popular position. But the reality is that the banking and financial services industry brought our economy close to the brink of collapse. And the boards of directors of companies were asleep at the switch. Companies had gotten greedy, and we really needed to put the fixes in place to make sure that there were adequate capital protections, to make sure that banks had resources if loans went bad. We needed the consumer protections that were in place and that got put in place by Dodd-Frank.
And this new Consumer Finance Protection Bureau.
It's a great thing to prevent abuses from happening. The reality is bank regulation in this country is aimed at making sure that the economy does not collapse, that banks don't fail. That would be terrible. And what the bank regulators do is they come in and they perform a check to make sure that banking is done in a safe and sound manner. I'm a big fan of it. I'm supportive of it, and I think we need to make sure that we adequately support the institutions that provide that check on the economy.
So you'd certainly be against any efforts to derail or to gut Dodd-Frank, which the Republicans have been trying to do ever since. Does it go far enough?
Oh, I think so. I think the protections that are in place in Dodd-Frank are sound ones. I don't know that we necessarily need to go any further, but we shouldn't weaken the law. That's for sure.
All right. Have the bankers taken any position on the 2016 presidential contest?
I am going to support whoever the Democratic candidate for president is. It's not a secret. We make a business in banking the Democratic Party. Many of the Democratic candidates are clients of the bank. We're very proud to do that. We offer a great service to not only the presidential candidates, but to many other candidates as well.
And many of the Democratic Party committees as well, correct?
Absolutely. I'm not sure where other banking executives will be. Some of them will be in support of the Democrats, but a bunch of them are going to be on the other side of the table.
You bet they are. you know they
sure
will be. Keith, great getting to know you. Great to know more about your work there at Amalgamated Bank. Thanks so much for coming in
Thanks
today.
for having me, Bill. I appreciate
don't forget, folks, wherever you are, you can check in, maybe become a customer here at amalgamatedbank.com.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. David Kennedy, Jennifer Lawless, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the show and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.